Judge Trent Albertson slammed his gavel so hard the water glass rattled off the bench. "Take that costume off," he growled, pointing straight at the man in the worn military coat. "This is a courthouse, not a Halloween parade." The room erupted in laughter. But the man standing at that defense table did not flinch, did not blink, did not move a single inch. And that should have been the first warning sign the judge ever had in his life. Because what happened next, inside that courtroom, would leave every single person in that room questioning everything they thought they knew about honor, sacrifice, and who really deserves respect. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city you're watching from. I read every single one. And if this story hits you the way I think it will, hit that subscribe button. You will not want to miss where this goes. The morning Benjamin Dawson walked into Northwood County Courthouse, the temperature outside was 21 degrees. Not the kind of cold that bites at your face and makes you run for the door. The kind of cold that settles into your bones and stays there. The kind that reminds you of certain nights in certain places most people are never going to know about. The kind that Ben had learned a long time ago to carry quietly. He walked up the courthouse steps with his son Ethan beside him. Ethan was 11, small for his age, with big brown eyes that took in everything, and a habit of asking questions that cut straight to the heart of whatever was happening around him. "Dad," Ethan said, looking up at the stone columns flanking the entrance, "are we going to be okay?" Ben put a hand on the boy's shoulder, gave it one firm squeeze. "We're going to be fine," he said. It was not a guarantee. Both of them understood that. But it was the truth in the only form Ben knew how to offer it. Short, steady, and without decoration. They pushed through the heavy front door together. The coat Ben wore that morning was not new. It had not been new for a long time. Dark olive green, thick wool, with a lining that had been restitched twice by Ben's own hands on a winter night in an apartment with no heat. On the left breast, pinned carefully and evenly, were his medals, not arranged for display, not polished for a show. Just there, the way they had always been there. The way scars are just there, not something you think about every morning. Not something you forget, either. He had worn that coat because it was the warmest thing he owned. That was the beginning and the end of the reason. Inside the courthouse, the hallway smelled like floor wax and old paper, and that particular institutional air that courthouses carry everywhere in America. The sense that serious things happen here, and the building itself has absorbed them all. Ben and Ethan found their way to courtroom 6 and took their seats on a wooden bench near the back. Ben looked at the paperwork in his hand. Custody modification hearing. Respondent, Benjamin Dawson. He folded it once and set it on his knee. Ethan leaned against his arm. "Dad," he whispered, "why is that man up there staring at us?" Ben raised his eyes. At the front of the room, behind the elevated bench, Judge Trent Albertson was already in his seat. He was a man in his early 60s, with iron gray hair, a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something expensive, and the kind of steady, evaluating stare that courtroom authority gives a certain type of man, and that certain type of man almost never learns to use with humility. Albertson was staring at Ben, specifically at the medals on Ben's coat. Ben looked back at him calmly and said nothing. "He's just doing his job," Ben told Ethan quietly. Ethan looked skeptical. "He doesn't look like he's doing his job. He looks like he's deciding something." Ben almost smiled. "Yeah," he said. "That's what judges do." The morning session moved through its early cases quickly. A landlord-tenant dispute, a minor traffic matter. Albertson handled each one with the precise, slightly impatient manner of a man who had been behind that bench for too long to be surprised by anything, and not quite long enough to have grown any real compassion. He ruled, he signed, he moved on. When the bailiff called Ben's case, Ben stood and walked Ethan to the front gallery row, where Ethan would sit and wait, and then step forward through the low wooden gate to the defense table. His public defender, a woman named Claire Donovan, was already there. Claire was in her early 40s, with a sharp face and glasses she kept pushing up the bridge of her nose when she was thinking hard. She had handled dozens of cases in this courtroom. She knew Albertson's rhythms. She knew what kind of morning it had been. She looked up when Ben sat down, and she said quietly, "Good morning. How are you holding up?" "Fine," Ben said. She studied him for a half-second. "Okay. We're going to keep this straightforward. Your record is clean, your employment history is solid, the school reports on Ethan are excellent. The argument being made against you is primarily financial. We address that directly, and we keep moving." "Understood," Ben said. He set his folded paperwork on the table and folded his hands on top of it. Claire glanced at the medals on his coat. She started to say something. Then Albertson's voice cut across the room like a blade through silence. "Mr. Dawson." Ben looked up. Albertson leaned forward slightly in his chair. His eyes moved over the medals with an expression that was not difficult to read. It was the particular expression of a man who has already decided something and is now simply announcing it to the room. "Is there a reason," Albertson said, his voice carrying the practiced, resonant authority of a man who has never had to raise it to be heard, "that you felt it necessary to come into my courtroom wearing—" He paused. "Let the pause do work. Whatever that is on your chest." A few people in the gallery made sounds. Not quite laughter yet. The kind of sound that is waiting to see which direction things go. Ben said, "It's a coat, Your Honor. It's cold outside." "I can see it's a coat, Mr. Dawson." Albertson's tone shifted slightly. Something sharper in it now. "I'm referring to the hardware on the front. The decorations. Are those supposed to be medals?" "They are medals, Your Honor." Another pause. Albertson tilted his head. "Military medals?" "Yes, sir." "Yours?" "Yes, sir." Albertson leaned back. He looked out at the gallery, and there it was, the faintest curl at the corner of his mouth. The kind of expression that invites other people to be in on something with you. "Well," he said, loudly enough that the whole room could hear it clearly, "we appreciate you dressing for the occasion, but I want to be very clear. This is a courthouse, not a costume party." The gallery laughed. It was not a big laugh. It was a courtroom, not a comedy club. But it was real laughter, and it filled the room for a moment, and it was directed at one man, and that man was Ben. Ethan, sitting in the front gallery row, went completely still. Ben looked at the judge. He did not look away. He did not change his expression. He said nothing. Claire Donovan's pen stopped moving. Albertson, encouraged by the response, continued. "Mr. Dawson, I have been on this bench for 19 years. I have seen people come in here wearing all manner of things. Uniforms, decorations, insignia of various kinds. In my experience, when a man comes into court wearing medals he did not earn, it is usually an attempt to generate sympathy, or, frankly, to intimidate." He leveled his gaze. "Neither of those strategies works in my courtroom." Ben said, very quietly, "Your Honor, I earned those medals." "Is that so?" It was not a question. It was the verbal equivalent of a closed door. "Yes, sir." "Well," Albertson waved a hand in a small, dismissive gesture, "we'll take your word for that. More sounds from the gallery. The energy in the room had a particular quality to it now, the kind of low-level electricity that comes when someone in authority decides, consciously or not, that a person in front of them is not worth taking seriously, and other people in the room decide to take their cue from that. Claire leaned slightly toward Ben. She said, very low, "Don't engage him on this. It's not the fight." Ben looked at her. Something in his eyes, not anger, not hurt, just clarity. Like a man who has stood in worse places than this and knows exactly where he is and what it costs to say the wrong thing at the wrong time. "I know," he said. Albertson moved the hearing along. The case being presented against Ben's custody arrangement had been filed by his ex-wife's attorney, a man named Gerald Stokes, who wore a suit that cost more than Ben's monthly rent and spoke with the smooth, carefully calibrated confidence of someone who knew how to make a clean story out of complicated facts. Stokes laid out the argument efficiently. Ben's current income, as a part-time contractor, was inconsistent. Ben's housing situation, a one-bedroom apartment that Ethan shared with him on rotating custody weeks, was not optimal for a growing child. Ben had no family support network in the area. The picture Stokes painted was not of a bad man exactly, just a limited one. Just a man who, through no particular fault of his own, was not enough. Ben sat and listened to this picture of himself and did not move. Ethan, in the front row, was watching his father's back. His hands were folded in his lap. He was very still in the way children are still when they are trying very hard not to cry. Claire pushed her glasses up and rose to respond. She was methodical. She addressed each point with documentation. Employment records showing Ben had been offered a full-time position starting in 2 weeks. A letter from Ethan's school principal describing Ethan as a thoughtful, well-adjusted student with strong attendance. A signed statement from Ben's landlord confirming the lease for a 2-bedroom upgrade had already been executed. She was good. Ben watched her work and was grateful for her. But Albertson interrupted her twice. Once to ask, in a tone that suggested skepticism without directly stating it, whether the employment documentation had been verified. Once to note, in passing, that a parent's financial instability was something the court had to take seriously, regardless of stated intentions. Both interruptions were procedurally legitimate, but the tone behind them was not neutral. Claire handled it. She kept her voice level and her points clear. But Ben could see, in the slight tightening around her eyes, that she was working harder in this room than she should have had to. The second time Albertson returned to the medals, it came sideways. He had been reviewing the character documentation, letters submitted by neighbors, by Ethan's soccer coach, by a woman at Ben's church who had known him for 6 years. He flipped through them with the mildly engaged expression of a man skimming a menu he has already largely decided on. "Mr. Dawson," he said, without looking up, "it says here that you are a veteran." "Yes, Your Honor." "Army?" "Yes, sir." Albertson set down the papers. He looked at Ben with that evaluating stare again. "What unit?" Ben said the unit designation, quietly, without inflection. Something moved across Albertson's face. He glanced at Stokes. Then he looked back at Ben. "And your rank at discharge?" "Sergeant Major, Your Honor." Albertson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, slowly, with a deliberateness that made it clear every word was intentional, "That's a high rank, Mr. Dawson. Sergeant Major. Delta Force. All those medals." Another pause. "For a man with that kind of distinguished service record, it's remarkable that you find yourself in, well..." He looked around the room. "This situation." It landed exactly the way he intended it to land. The implication was clear to everyone in the room. If all of that were real, you would not be here like this. Ethan made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound, small and involuntary. The kind a person makes when something hits them unexpectedly. Ben turned his head just enough to see his son. Ethan's face was tight. His jaw was set. He was 11 years old, and he was fighting very hard to hold something back. Ben looked at him. He held his son's eyes for one long moment. And without words, something passed between them. Something Ben had tried his whole life to give this boy. Something that could not be put in a courtroom document or argued before a bench. The understanding that the world will sometimes be unfair to you, that people with authority will sometimes use it badly, and that how you stand in those moments is yours. It belongs to you. No one can take it. Ethan steadied. Ben turned back to face the judge. Claire had risen to object. Albertson overruled her before she finished the sentence. During the brief recess, Ben stood outside the courtroom doors in the hallway. Ethan was beside him. They stood at a window that looked out over the courthouse parking lot, and the sky above it was low and gray and heavy. Ethan said, "He's lying about you." Ben said, "He doesn't know me. You can't lie about what you don't know. You can just be wrong." "He's being wrong on purpose." Ben was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Maybe, but it doesn't change anything." Ethan looked at him. "It doesn't make you angry?" Ben thought about that question seriously. He always took Ethan's questions seriously. "It makes me tired," he said finally. "Anger costs a lot. I learned that a long time ago. It costs you more than it costs the person you're angry at. So I try not to spend it unless I have to." Ethan looked at the parking lot. "Where did you learn that?" "Fallujah," Ben said. Ethan was quiet. He had heard that word before. In the particular way children hear words that belong to a part of their parents' life they are not yet old enough to fully understand. As a word that means something large and serious and beyond the current moment. "Is that where you got the medals?" Ethan asked. "Some of them." Ethan turned to look at the medals on his father's coat. He reached up, slowly, and touched one of them with 2 fingers, very gently, the way you touch something that belongs to someone else. "I know they're real," he said. Ben looked at his son. "I know you do." "I just want everyone else to know, too." Ben put his arm around the boy's shoulders. "Some things," he said carefully, "you have to wait for." Ethan frowned. "Why does the truth have to wait?" Ben did not answer right away. He was looking out the window. Something had moved in his expression. Something old and far away and very quiet. Something that did not belong in a courthouse hallway on a cold Tuesday morning, but had been brought here anyway, the way veterans carry certain things into every room they enter. Not because they choose to, but because those things are simply part of them now. "It doesn't have to wait forever," Ben said finally. Claire Donovan met them in the hallway before they went back in. She looked at Ben with an expression he recognized. The look of someone who has something to say and is deciding how to say it. "Ben," she said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." "Okay." "Those medals." She glanced at his coat. "The insignia under the lapel. I caught a glimpse of it during the session. Is there something about your service record that we haven't used yet? Something that could be relevant here?" Ben looked at her for a long moment. "There are things in my record," he said slowly, "that are not public." Claire kept her voice even. "What does that mean?" "It means they're classified, some of them." She pushed her glasses up. How classified? The kind that requires a specific clearance to access. She stared at him. Ben, why didn't you tell me this before? He was quiet for a moment. Then, because I didn't want it to be about that. I wanted to stand on what anyone could see. What I've done for Ethan. How I've been his father. I didn't want to... He stopped, looked down for a moment. I didn't want to pull rank. You understand what I'm saying? Claire looked at him a long time. Something in her expression shifted. She said quietly, I understand what you're saying, and I respect it. But Ben... I know, he said. Things are not going the way they should in there. I know. So if there's something that changes the picture, there may be something coming, Ben said carefully, that I didn't arrange and didn't ask for, but I think you should be ready for it. Claire blinked. What does that mean? Ben straightened the medals on his coat. His jaw was set. His eyes were clear. It means, he said, let's go back in. They filed back through the courtroom doors. Ethan took his seat. Ben took his. Claire settled her papers. Albertson returned to the bench with the settled authority of a man who has already decided the shape of the afternoon. He looked at Ben, and once more, one final time, the curl appeared at the corner of his mouth. Let's continue, he said. What he did not know, what no one in that room yet knew, not Claire, not Stokes, not the gallery, not the bailiff, not a single person in courtroom 6 of Northwood County Courthouse, was that 2 floors below them, in the building's main lobby, the front doors had just opened, and the sound of boot heels on marble had begun. The boot heels were steady, unhurried, the kind of stride that does not speed up or slow down for anything, because it never has to. But up in courtroom 6, nobody heard them yet. Albertson had resumed the hearing with the same brisk authority he carried through every session, the kind of efficiency that looked like fairness from a distance, but felt like something else entirely when you were the one sitting at the defense table. He shuffled papers. He directed questions. He moved the morning forward the way a man moves through a task he considers already completed. Gerald Stokes stood and summarized his position one more time, smoothly, the way a man summarizes something when he believes the room already agrees with him. He talked about consistency. He talked about stability. He used the word optimal 3 times in 4 sentences, and each time he said it, he glanced at Ben with the particular expression of a man who has nothing personal against you, but is being paid to make you look small, and has found, today, that it is not very difficult. Ben sat with his hands flat on the table. Claire leaned toward him and whispered, "Stay with me. We're not done." Ben nodded once. Albertson looked over his reading glasses at the documents in front of him. "Mr. Dawson," he said, not unkindly, but not with any warmth either. "I want to give you the opportunity to speak directly to the court's concerns. Not through documentation, not through counsel. Your own words. Can you do that?" Ben stood. "Yes, Your Honor." "Tell me, in plain language, why this court should be confident that your son's current living situation is in his best interest." It was a fair question, framed the way it was, in that particular room, with the energy that had been built up across the morning. It did not entirely feel like one. But Ben answered it the way he answered everything, straight. "Ethan is doing well," he said. "His grades are strong. He has friends, he has routines. He knows where his home is, and he knows his father is there." He paused. I have never missed a day that was mine. I have never been late for a pickup. When he has been sick, I have been there. When he has had a hard day at school, I have been there. The only thing I haven't been able to give him is money I don't yet have. But that changes in 2 weeks. I have the documentation. Ms. Donovan has submitted it. Albertson looked at him for a moment. Sergeant Major Dawson. He let the title sit in the air, with just enough weight to make clear he was not entirely sure what to do with it. Dedication to a child is not only measured in presence. It is measured in capacity. Do you understand that distinction? Yes, sir. Then you understand the court's concern. I understand it, Ben said. I just disagree with the conclusion. Something moved in the gallery. Not laughter this time. Something else. A kind of attention that had not quite been there before. Albertson's eyes sharpened slightly. You disagree with the court's conclusion. I disagree with the conclusion that a temporary financial difficulty makes me less of a father than I am. Yes, sir. The silence that followed had a different quality to it than the silences that had come before. Albertson set down his pen. He looked at Ben with an expression that was harder to read now. Something between reassessment and irritation. The look of a man who expected one kind of resistance and has encountered another. Mr. Dawson, he said slowly, I will remind you that this court operates on evidence, not conviction. I understand that, Your Honor. The evidence is in front of you. I'm asking you to read it. Claire put a hand on Ben's arm, not pulling him down, just steadying. He understood the signal, and he sat. Albertson looked at him for another long moment. Then he looked down at his papers, and then he said, with the deliberate casualness of a man who believes himself to be in complete control of a room, I'll also note for the record that the character testimonials submitted on Mr. Dawson's behalf, while numerous, do not include any statement from a superior officer or any verified military contact who can speak to the nature or legitimacy of the service record Mr. Dawson has referenced. He glanced at the medals without pointing to them directly, which I find somewhat notable. Claire was on her feet immediately. Your Honor, my client's service record is not at issue in these proceedings. The relevance of that observation is... Counsel. Albertson's voice was flat. I am establishing the scope of the character record. Sit down. Claire sat. Her jaw was tight. Ben could see it from where he was sitting. Ethan, in the front row, had both hands pressed flat on his knees. He was staring at the judge with the focused, unblinking attention of a child who has stopped trying to process what is happening and has simply decided to watch it very carefully and remember it. Ben looked at his son. He held his gaze for just a moment and gave a small, almost invisible nod. I see you. I'm okay. Stay steady. Ethan straightened in his seat. Gerald Stokes was making a note on his legal pad with the relaxed concentration of a man watching a play he has seen before and knows the ending of. Claire leaned to Ben and said, very quietly, her voice barely above a breath, He's editorializing. It's not proper. I can file on this after the fact. I know, Ben said, equally low. Does it help you to know that? He thought about it. Not right now, he said honestly. She gave a small, grim nod. No, me neither. Albertson was speaking again. He was reviewing the financial documentation now, walking through it line by line, with the slow, pointed precision of a man who wants his skepticism to be visible. He questioned the start date of the new employment contract. He noted that a verbal offer, even if written, was not the same as a first paycheck. He observed, twice, that financial projections were not the same as financial reality. Every point was technically defensible. Every point landed like something else. Ben listened and kept his hands still on the table, and thought about a night in 2004, when he had been pinned down in a street that had no right name on any map he had ever seen, with 3 men depending on him to make the right call in the next 30 seconds. And he had made it. He thought about that, not to comfort himself. He did not need comfort, but because it reminded him of something important. The most dangerous moments in any situation were not the ones that looked the most dramatic. They were the quiet ones. The ones where someone was slowly, methodically, in a perfectly controlled voice, taking something from you. That was the moment that required the most discipline. Not the explosion, the slow erosion. He was not going to be eroded. Claire made her final rebuttal efficiently and cleanly. She hit the numbers. She hit the school records. She cited precedent. She was composed and precise and professionally excellent, and Ben was grateful for every word. When she sat down, Albertson made several notes. The room was quiet. Stokes was rereading something on his tablet. The bailiff stood near the side wall with his arms folded and his expression carefully neutral. And then Ethan stood up. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't ask permission. He simply stood up from his seat in the front gallery row and said, in a voice that was slightly too loud for the room and slightly too clear for an 11-year-old who was frightened, "I want to say something." Every head in the room turned. Albertson looked at the boy. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, exactly, but a moment of recalibration. "Young man, this is not—" "I know it's not my turn," Ethan said. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. Ben could see the hands from the defense table. "I know how court works. My dad explained it to me. But nobody in here is saying the right things about him, and I—" He stopped. He took one breath. "I just want to say one thing, and then I'll sit back down." The room was completely still. Albertson looked at Ethan for a long moment. Something crossed his face that was hard to name. He said, finally, "One thing." Ethan nodded. He turned slightly so that he was facing not just the judge, but the whole room. His voice did not shake when he spoke. "My dad," he said, "wakes up at 5 in the morning to make sure I have breakfast before school. He drives 40 minutes each way to my soccer games, even when he has work. When I was sick last year and scared, he sat on the floor outside my bedroom door all night because he didn't want me to feel alone." He paused. "He doesn't talk about the things he did in the army. He never talks about them. But I know what those medals are. I know what they mean. And he didn't bring them in here to show off." His voice cracked on the last 2 words, and he pulled it back with visible effort. "He wore them because they're part of who he is. And who he is," Ethan looked at his father across the room, "is the best person I know." He sat down. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room that has nothing to say. It was the silence of a room that is recalibrating. That is, quietly, collectively, taking stock of what just happened and adjusting its understanding of the morning accordingly. Gerald Stokes set down his pen. Claire Donovan was very still. Albertson looked at Ethan for a long moment. Then he looked at Ben. And in Albertson's expression, for just a fraction of a second, something moved. The kind of thing that moves in a person when they have just seen something they did not expect to see and are not quite ready to account for it. It passed. His face closed again. He looked down at his papers. "The court appreciates the young man's statement," he said, in the flat, procedural tone of a man putting something away carefully. However, the courtroom door opened. Not quietly, not disruptively, but with the particular authority of a door opened by someone who moves through rooms as if the rooms are always ready for them. A sound preceded the entrance. Not loud, just distinct. The precise, measured sound of dress shoes on a hard floor, moving at a pace that communicated everything. The bailiff straightened without being told to. 3 people came through the door. The first 2 were in military dress uniform, moving in the coordinated, unhurried manner of officers who are not in a hurry because they do not need to be. They held the door. They stood aside. And the third person walked in. 4 stars. The uniform was immaculate, dark and precise, with ribbons and decorations that covered the chest in a dense, formal record of a career that could not be summarized in a hallway or explained in a single session. The posture was the kind that does not come from trying to stand straight. It comes from decades of being the kind of person that rooms rearrange themselves around. General Dana Brooks walked into courtroom 6 of Northwood County Courthouse, and the room went absolutely still. Not the procedural stillness of a court waiting for instruction, the deep, involuntary stillness of a room full of people who have just understood, all at once, that something they thought was a small and ordinary morning has just become something else entirely. Albertson's pen stopped moving. Stokes looked up from his tablet. His expression, for the first time all morning, had no practiced confidence in it at all. Claire Donovan turned in her chair. She saw the uniform. She saw the stars. She looked at Ben. Ben had not moved. He was sitting at the defense table with his hands flat and his back straight, and his face completely, utterly composed, as if he had been waiting for this, as if he had always known this moment would arrive, had decided long ago how he would sit when it did, and had simply been keeping that decision until now. General Brooks walked down the center aisle of the gallery. Her eyes moved to Ben, and something crossed her face that was unmistakable. Not sentiment, not performance. The specific, uncomplicated recognition of one soldier for another. The kind that needs no explanation because it has no agenda. It simply is what it is. She stopped at the low wooden gate. She looked at the judge. Albertson opened his mouth. She spoke first. "Your Honor," she said, and her voice was the voice of a person who has given orders in places where the wrong word gets people killed, and has learned, from that, exactly how much weight a word can carry. "My name is General Dana Brooks. I am the commanding officer, retired, of the unit in which Sergeant Major Benjamin Dawson served." She held up a single document. "I have a statement for this court." The room did not make a sound. Albertson looked at the document. He looked at the 4 stars on her collar. He looked at Ben. And for the first time that morning, for the first time, Ben thought, in a very long time, if you looked closely enough, Judge Trent Albertson did not look entirely certain of what came next. "General," he said carefully, "this is an ongoing family court proceeding. I'm not sure how—" "I understand what it is," Brooks said evenly. "I also understand that the character of the man you are ruling on has been called into question this morning. Specifically," her eyes moved to the medals on Ben's coat and back to the bench, "the nature and legitimacy of his service record." She set the document on the railing of the gate. "This court will want to read that before it proceeds." Nobody moved. Ethan, in the front row, was watching General Brooks with his hands still pressed flat on his knees, his eyes wide and steady, and full of something that was working its way slowly toward a feeling he would not have a name for until he was much older. The feeling of watching someone walk into a room and change it completely simply by being who they are. Ben turned his head slightly and looked at his son. Ethan looked back at him. And without a word, without a sound, with only the language that had always existed between them, the language of a father and a son who have learned to say enormous things in very small gestures, Ben's eyes said, "Now you know. This is what patience looks like when it finally arrives." Albertson reached forward and picked up the document. The room waited. Albertson read slowly. That was the first thing everyone noticed. He was not a slow reader. Anyone who had watched him move through morning dockets knew that. He could scan a legal brief the way other men scanned a menu. Fast, decisive, done. But he read this document slowly. He read it the way a person reads something when each line is adjusting something inside them, when the words are arriving faster than the understanding can keep up, when the mind keeps going back to the top of a paragraph because it needs to confirm that it read what it thinks it read. The two officers who had come in with General Brooks stood at the back of the gallery. Still, composed. They did not look around the room. They looked straight ahead, and their stillness had a weight to it that the room felt, without entirely understanding why. Claire Donovan had turned back toward the front, but Ben could see her peripheral focus. She was tracking every micro-expression on Albertson's face and storing it. That was her job. She was doing it. Gerald Stokes had set down his tablet completely. He sat with both hands on the table, and an expression that was working very hard to remain professionally neutral, and not entirely succeeding. His eyes moved from the document to the general, to Ben, and back to the document. Ben did not look at any of them. He looked at Ethan. Ethan was still sitting with his back straight and his hands on his knees, but his eyes were moving now between General Brooks and his father with the rapid, searching attention of a boy trying to put together pieces of something he had always known existed, but had never been allowed to fully see. He looked at Ben. Ben gave him nothing. No expression, no signal. Just presence. Just the steady, anchoring fact of a father sitting exactly where he said he would be. General Brooks had not moved from the gate. She stood with her hands at her sides and waited with the particular patience of a person who has learned that some rooms need time to catch up. The bailiff was the only person in courtroom 6 who appeared entirely uncertain about his role at this particular moment. He stood near the wall with his arms at his sides instead of folded, slightly straighter than usual. Eyes on the general, the way a man's eyes go when instinct tells him that rank in the room has just rearranged itself significantly, and protocol has not yet caught up. Albertson turned a page. The sound of that single page turning was the loudest thing in the room. He read. His jaw moved slightly, the way a jaw moves when a person is processing something by feel as much as by reading. He turned another page. He stopped at something in the lower third of the second page and did not move for several seconds. His expression did not collapse. Albertson was not the kind of man whose expressions collapsed. But something in it changed in the way a foundation changes, not visible on the surface until you look at the edges and notice that the lines are no longer quite where they were. He looked up. He looked at Ben. Ben met his eyes steadily and said nothing. Albertson looked back down at the document. He read the final page. He set the papers down with the careful, deliberate movement of a man handling something he has decided to treat with a different kind of respect than he was prepared for when the morning began. He was quiet for a moment. The room let him be quiet because no one, not Claire, not Stokes, not the gallery, not anyone, was entirely sure yet what the document said, only that it had done something to the man who had just read it, and they were waiting to find out what. Then Albertson looked at General Brooks. "General," he said, and his voice had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would register as an apology or a reversal. But the particular edge in it, the practiced authority of a man who uses his position the way some men use a tool, casually and constantly, that edge was gone. What remained was something more careful. "I would like to ask the court's permission to have you speak directly." Brooks looked at him evenly. "I was planning to." She came through the low gate. The bailiff moved to offer her the witness stand, but she did not go to the witness stand. She walked to the center of the well, the open floor between the gallery and the bench, and she stood there, the way she had probably stood in 100 briefings, in rooms that made this courtroom look very small indeed. And she addressed the court. "Sergeant Major Benjamin Dawson," she said, "served in the United States Army for 19 years. He served 3 combat tours, 2 in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. During his final tour in 2007, Sergeant Major Dawson led a field operation in Fallujah under conditions that I am not at liberty to describe in full detail in an open proceeding." She paused to let that land. "What I can tell you is that the operation involved the extraction of 4 American personnel from a situation that had, in the preceding 48 hours, become what we classify as catastrophic." Sergeant Major Dawson made decisions during that operation that are documented in the classified record, decisions that saved 4 lives. She paused again. "One of those lives was mine." The room absorbed this. Ethan's mouth had opened slightly. He was staring at General Brooks, and then at his father, and then back at Brooks, with the expression of a boy who has just heard something that rearranges the known world. Albertson said nothing. Brooks continued. "The medals you see on Sergeant Major Dawson's coat this morning include the Bronze Star with Valor, the Purple Heart, the Army Commendation Medal with Valor device, and the Combat Infantryman Badge. He was nominated for the Medal of Honor following the 2007 operation. That nomination is part of his classified record." She looked at the bench directly. "These are not decorations, Your Honor. They are a record of what this man did and what it cost him and what he chose to do anyway." Albertson picked up his pen. He set it down again. "General Brooks," he said carefully, "I want to be clear that this court's proceedings this morning were not directed at—" "Your Honor." Her voice was not raised. It did not need to be raised. "I have been in this building for 11 minutes. I was made aware of these proceedings 3 days ago through a mutual contact. I did not come here to argue procedure." She looked at Ben for one brief moment, and then back at the bench. "I came here because Sergeant Major Dawson is not the kind of man who will defend himself by pulling rank. He never has been. He won't tell you what he did. He won't show you what he is. He will stand in front of you and answer your questions and take whatever you give him and not ask for anything different, because that is exactly how he has operated in every environment I have ever observed him in." Her voice did not soften, but something in its quality shifted, the way certain kinds of iron shift when they have been heated to the right point. Not weaker, but somehow more precise. "So I am here, because someone should say it plainly, and because he has more than earned the right to have someone say it for him." The gallery was not breathing. Claire Donovan's hand had stopped moving entirely. The pen was still in her fingers, but she had forgotten it was there. Stokes had turned his tablet face down on the table. He was looking at the floor in front of him with the expression of a man reassessing the decision that brought him to this particular Tuesday. Ben sat at the defense table and did not move. He was not performing composure. He was not holding it together by force of will. He was simply there, the same way he had been there all morning, the same way he had been in 100 harder places than this. Present, still, and privately. Quietly. At a cost no one in the room could see, holding the line between everything he felt and everything the moment required. His jaw was tight. That was all. If you were watching closely enough, you would see that. The jaw, and maybe the way his hands were pressed very flat on the table. The way hands press when they are preventing themselves from doing something else. Ethan was watching his father's hands. He had always watched his father's hands. He had learned very young that his father's face gave very little away, but the hands sometimes told the truth in small increments. And right now the hands were telling the truth. They were telling it quietly, the way his father did everything. But they were telling it. Ethan stood up. Not impulsively this time. Not the way he had stood before, with the trembling urgency of a boy who can no longer stay still. This was different. He stood slowly, deliberately, and he walked forward to the wooden gate, and he stood there, looking at his father's back. Ben heard the sound of his son's footsteps. He turned. Ethan was standing at the gate. His eyes were bright and very serious. He said, low enough that it was almost private, "Dad, are you okay?" Ben looked at his son for a long moment. He said, "Yeah, buddy, I'm okay." "Promise?" "Promise." Ethan nodded once. He looked at the medals on his father's coat, looked at them with different eyes than he had an hour ago. The way you look at something you always believed in, when you have just been given the formal, documented proof that your belief was correct. He looked at them, and then he looked at his father's face, and something moved in his expression that was not sadness, and not pride exactly, but the specific, irreversible feeling of understanding something for the first time at its full size. He went back to his seat. Albertson had been watching this exchange. He looked at the father, and then the son, and then down at his hands, folded on the bench in front of him. He was quiet for a moment, that stretched long enough that the room began to wonder, with a particular kind of courtroom tension, what came next. "General Brooks," he said finally, and his voice had the careful, measured quality of a man choosing his words with more attention than he had been using earlier in the morning. "I want to ask you a direct question." "Go ahead." "In your professional assessment, and based on your knowledge of Sergeant Major Dawson's character over the course of your service together." He paused. He looked at his papers, and then back at her. "Do you have any concern about his capacity as a parent?" Brooks looked at him with an expression that was very still and very direct. "None," she said. "None whatsoever." "And Albertson stopped, started again. "And the matters of financial instability that have been raised in these proceedings." "Your Honor." Her voice was patient, but not warm. "I have watched this man make life and death decisions under conditions that would break most people. I have watched him maintain discipline, protect others, and perform under pressure that has no civilian equivalent. If he tells this court that he has a plan to stabilize his financial situation and provide for his son, I am not uncertain about his ability to execute that plan. Not for 1 second." Albertson was quiet. Stokes did not stand up. That, more than anything else, told Claire Donovan something important about how the energy in the room had shifted. Stokes was good at his job, and he knew his moments. The fact that he had not stood up to object to a single word of General Brooks's statement, the fact that he was sitting with his hands folded and his tablet face down and his mouth closed, meant that he had already made the professional calculation and arrived at a conclusion. You do not argue against 4 stars and a Medal of Honor nomination and a combat rescue of a commanding officer in a family court proceeding about a child's living situation. You sit down and you adjust your strategy, and you find a way to make the loss look like a decision you participated in. Claire knew that look. She had seen it before on other faces in other proceedings. She leaned very slightly toward Ben and said, very low, "He's standing down." Ben said nothing. His eyes were on General Brooks. Brooks had not moved from the center of the well. She stood the way she had been standing since she walked in, composed, certain, and with the unhurried confidence of a person who came here to say specific things and intends to say them completely. She turned from the bench and looked at Ben directly for the first time since she had begun speaking. "Sergeant Major," she said. Ben stood, not because protocol demanded it. There was no protocol for this moment. Not in a courthouse, not in this context. He stood because the body sometimes knows what a moment requires before the mind has finished reasoning it through. He stood the way he had always stood when she addressed him, from the first day they had served in the same unit, 17 years ago. "General," he said. She looked at him the way people look at someone they have been through something with that cannot be explained to anyone who was not there. Something direct and clear, and with nothing performative in it. "You should have told me about this hearing sooner," she said. "I know. I had to hear about it from Colonel Marsh." "I know, General. Why didn't you call me?" He was quiet for a moment. The room was quiet with him. "Because it wasn't supposed to be about what I did over there," he said. "It was supposed to be about who I am here, as a father, in this city, in his life." He tilted his head very slightly toward where Ethan was sitting. "I didn't want to use one to win the other." Brooks looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said, and the way she said it was different from the way Albertson had said things all morning. There was no performance in it, no authority being deployed, no room being managed. It was just true. She knew. She had always known exactly who he was. "That's why I came." The room was very still. And then General Dana Brooks did something that no one in courtroom 6 that morning was prepared for. She turned to face Ben fully. She came to attention. Her spine was already perfect, but something in her bearing shifted in the precise, formal way that military bearing shifts when a gesture is deliberate and documented and meant to be seen. She raised her right hand. She saluted him. Not the bench, not the court, not the room. Him. Benjamin Dawson, in his worn olive coat with its old medals and its patched lining, standing at the defense table of a family court proceeding in Northwood County, received a salute from a 4-star general, and the room around him went so quiet that the sound of the heating system in the walls was briefly audible. Ben brought his right hand up, slowly, with the same unhurried, unshaking precision that had characterized everything he had done since he walked through the courthouse door that morning. He returned the salute. They held it for 3 seconds. Then both hands came down. Ethan, in the front row, pressed both hands over his mouth. His eyes were full. He did not make a sound. He just looked at his father with those big brown eyes, full of something that was going to take him years to fully understand, and would stay with him for the rest of his life. Claire Donovan looked down at her papers. She pressed her lips together. She looked back up. Albertson sat at his bench and looked at the two of them, the general and the sergeant major, and whatever was moving through him in that moment lived behind his face, where it was not going to be visible to anyone watching. But his hands, folded on the bench in front of him, were no longer the relaxed hands of a man who believes he is in complete control of a room. He picked up his pen. He set it down again. He said, in a voice that was quieter than any voice he had used all morning, "I think," he said, "we should take a short recess." The recess lasted 22 minutes. Ben knew because he counted them, not by watching the clock on the wall, but by the way time moves when you are sitting in a hallway with your son and a four-star general and the full weight of a morning that is not yet finished with you. Time in those moments does not move at its regular pace. It thickens. Each minute has more mass than usual. They sat on a wooden bench outside courtroom 6, Ben and Ethan, and General Brooks stood a few feet away, speaking quietly with one of her officers. The second officer had gone downstairs. The hallway was mostly empty, except for a court clerk who passed through once, slowed briefly when she saw the general's uniform, and kept walking. Ethan was pressed against Ben's side the way he used to press when he was much younger, in that instinctive, boneless way of a child seeking physical reassurance from a parent. He was too old for it, and he knew it, and he did it anyway. And Ben let him, because some things matter more than the appearance of being too old for them. They sat that way without speaking for a while. Then Ethan said quietly, "Were you ever going to tell me?" Ben looked at him. "Tell you what?" "About Fallujah. About what you did. About—" He gestured vaguely in the direction of General Brooks. "All of it." Ben thought about that. He thought about it the way he thought about the questions that deserved real answers, not the questions that needed quick ones. "I was going to tell you some of it," he said, "when you were older." "How much older?" "I don't know. Old enough to carry it without it changing how you see regular days?" Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Ben said carefully, "that some things, when you know them fully, make ordinary life feel less real, or too fragile. I didn't want that for you. Not yet." Ethan was quiet, processing this. "Is that why you never talked about the medals?" "Partly." "What's the other part?" Ben looked down the hallway. "The other part is that the men I think about when I look at those medals are not here anymore. And talking about what I did feels like—" He stopped, searched for the right words. "Like taking credit for a story that belongs to all of us, not just me." Ethan absorbed this slowly, the way he absorbed things that were too large to understand all at once, but that he was determined to understand eventually. He looked at the medals on his father's coat with the same careful attention he had given them inside the courtroom, but differently now. Not with the protectiveness he'd had before, with something more like grief. The understanding that what he was looking at was not just a record of courage, it was a record of cost. "I'm proud of you," he said. His voice was very simple, just the words, undecorated. Ben put his arm around the boy. "I know," he said. "I know you are." General Brooks finished her conversation with her officer and walked over. She stood in front of the bench and looked at both of them for a moment with that direct, even gaze that seemed to operate on a different frequency than most people's attention. Like a piece of equipment calibrated to register things that ordinary instruments miss. "He asks good questions," she said to Ben, with the smallest nod toward Ethan. "He always has," Ben said. Brooks looked at Ethan directly. "Your father never asked for recognition. In 19 years, I never once heard him ask for it. You understand that that's unusual." Ethan looked at her seriously. "Yes, ma'am." "Most people, when they've done something significant, want someone to know about it. That's human. That's normal. Your father is—" She paused, chose. "Not wired that way, which is both his greatest strength and the reason he ends up in hallways like this one." She said it without sentiment, the way you state a fact about weather or terrain. He trusts that the truth will eventually be visible. He's usually right. He just sometimes has to wait longer than he should. Ethan looked at his father. then back at the general. Is that what today was? The truth being visible? That's exactly what today was, she said. She looked at Ben. Something passed between them in the brief, economical way that things pass between people who have been in real situations together. A whole conversation compressed into 2 seconds of eye contact. She said, Albertson is going to come back in there a different man than the one who called your coat a costume. Ben said, You don't know that. I've been in enough rooms to know when a man has just recalculated, she said. He's recalculating. The question is whether he has the character to do it cleanly, or whether he does it in a way that tries to preserve his dignity at your expense. She looked at the courtroom door. We'll see what he's made of. Ben was quiet. Then he said, General, you didn't have to come here. No, she agreed. I didn't. I mean it. This wasn't your... Ben. Her voice was not unkind, but it was firm. Do you remember what you said to me in the vehicle on the way out of that street? When we were clear of the building and I was asking you why you went back in? He was quiet. You said, because you were still in there. She looked at him steadily. That's all. No speech, no explanation, just that. She straightened her jacket slightly. So don't tell me I didn't have to come here. I know what I have to do. Ben looked at her for a long moment. He did not say thank you. She would not have wanted him to, and both of them knew it. Instead, he gave her a single, small nod that contained everything the moment needed and nothing it didn't. She nodded back. The courtroom door opened, and the bailiff stepped out. He looked at Ben, then at the general, and said, in the slightly stunned, careful tone of a man who has been a courthouse bailiff for 12 years and is having an unusual day, Judge Albertson is ready to reconvene. They went back in. The room had changed while they were gone. Not visibly. The benches were the same, the lights were the same, the layout was identical. But the quality of attention in the gallery had shifted. People who had been sitting with the loose, half-engaged posture of observers at a routine proceeding were now sitting differently, straighter, more present, with the particular alertness of people who know that what they are watching has moved out of the category of routine and into the category of something they will likely describe to someone later. Gerald Stokes was at his table. He had a fresh legal pad in front of him. He was making notes on it, though from the angle and frequency of his writing, it was less clear that he was preparing arguments and more clear that he was reorganizing his position. His suit was still immaculate. His posture was still composed. But the calibrated confidence of the morning, that practiced, polished ease, had been replaced by something more careful. The confidence of a man who has revised his assessment and is not yet sure what the new one should look like. Claire Donovan was already at the defense table. When Ben sat down, she leaned toward him and said under her breath, "He asked my opposing counsel for a 5-minute private conference before he called the recess." Stokes came out looking like a man who had been given information he didn't want. Ben said, "What kind of information?" "The kind that changes your calculation." She looked at him over the top of her glasses. "I don't know what's in that document, but Albertson asked his clerk to make a copy and log it. Whatever it is, it's now part of the formal record of this proceeding." Ben absorbed this. "Okay." "Okay," Claire repeated, with a dryness that was not unkind. "You know, most of my clients would be asking me a lot of questions right now." "I know what's in the document," Ben said. "More or less." She looked at him. "And you're not going to tell me?" "Most of it is classified," he said simply. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for one brief moment with the expression of a woman who has been a public defender for 14 years and believes she has encountered most of the surprises this job contains, and is now confronting evidence that she has not. "Fine," she said. "Fine." Ethan was in his seat in the front gallery row. He was sitting with the composed, watchful stillness of a boy who has made a private decision to be as steady as his father for the remainder of the morning. His hands were in his lap. His back was straight. He caught his father's eye and gave him a small, deliberate nod, a gesture so precisely like one of Ben's own that it would have made Ben smile in a different kind of moment. General Brooks had taken a seat in the gallery, one row back from where the two officers flanking her had settled. She sat the way she stood, without excess, without posture for show, simply occupying her space with a matter-of-fact certainty of someone who is comfortable taking up exactly as much room as they take up, and not a fraction more. Albertson came in. Everyone stood, then sat. He arranged his papers. He adjusted his reading glasses. He was quiet for a moment, in a way that was different from his earlier silences. This was not the silence of authority composing itself to deliver judgment. It was the silence of a man who has decided something and is being careful about the first word. He looked up. He looked at Ben. "Mr. Dawson," he said, and the title this time, not Sergeant Major, not the mocking, almost question he'd used before, just Mr. Dawson, carried a weight of intention in it. The intention of a man who is not going to give a speech, but who is going to say what he says clearly. "I have reviewed General Brooks's statement and the supporting documentation provided to this court." Ben said nothing. He waited. "I want to address something before we proceed," Albertson said. He removed his glasses. This was unusual. In a morning of watching the man, Ben had noticed that Albertson used his glasses as a tool of management, on when he was processing, off when he was delivering something definitive. He was putting the management tool away. "Earlier this morning, I made remarks in this courtroom regarding the items on your coat, the nature and origin of those items." He paused. His jaw moved slightly. "Those remarks were—" He stopped again. Started over. "I do not have complete information about every individual who comes before this bench. That is the nature of this work. However, the manner in which I chose to express skepticism this morning was not appropriate." His voice was even, controlled, not warm, but honest in the specific, uncomfortable way that honesty is when it comes at a cost. I want that acknowledged in the record. The room was very still. Claire made a quick note. Stokes did not look up from his legal pad. Ben looked at Albertson and said, simply and without ceremony, "Thank you, Your Honor." Albertson put his glasses back on. He looked at his papers and then back up. "Let's return to the matter before this court." What followed over the next 40 minutes was a different proceeding than the one that had occupied the morning. Albertson moved through the remaining issues with a precision that was no less rigorous than before. He was not performing sentiment, was not overcompensating, was not trying to be something he was not. But the framing had shifted. The questions he asked Claire were questions aimed at resolving ambiguity rather than amplifying it. When documentation was presented, he treated it as documentation rather than as something to be interrogated for underlying motive. He asked Ben directly about the new employment contract. Ben answered. He asked about the timeline for the two-bedroom apartment. Ben answered. He asked about Ethan's school schedule, his activities, the structure of the weeks when he stayed with his father. Ben answered all of it the same way he had answered everything. Short, direct, true. At one point, Albertson said, "Mr. Dawson, The documentation indicates that Ethan's academic performance has improved in the past 2 semesters. Can you speak to that? Ben said, "We work on his assignments together in the evenings. He's strong in math and working on his reading comprehension. We have a routine. Dinner, then an hour at the table with his schoolwork. Then we talk for a while before bed." He paused. "He's a smart kid. He just needs someone to sit with him." Albertson looked at him for a moment over his glasses. "And you sit with him?" "Every night that he's with me," Ben said. "Yes." Albertson made a note. Stokes, when given the floor for his rebuttal period, spoke for 4 minutes. The morning's version of Gerald Stokes, smooth, precise, building a case with the unhurried confidence of a man certain of his conclusion, had been replaced by a version that was technically competent, but clearly working from a revised set of priorities. He maintained the position about financial instability. He did not return to questions about character. He did not glance at Ben's medals. He made his points, acknowledged certain documented improvements in Ben's situation, and sat down. Claire, given the final word, stood and said simply, "Your Honor, the record speaks for itself. Sergeant Major Dawson is a dedicated, capable, and loving father. The concerns raised in this filing have been addressed thoroughly and in good faith. We ask the court to maintain the existing custody arrangement." She sat. Albertson was quiet for a moment that was not dramatic. It was simply the quiet of a man finishing a thought. He said, "The court finds that the documentation submitted by the respondent adequately addresses the financial concerns raised in the petitioner's filing. The court further notes the testimony of General Dana Brooks regarding the respondent's character, which this court found credible and relevant to the full picture of the individual before us." He looked at Ben over his glasses. "The existing custody arrangement will remain in effect. The petitioner's modification request is denied." Claire exhaled. It was barely audible. Ben heard it. He sat very still for 1 moment. Then he turned to look at Ethan. Ethan had both hands pressed to his mouth again, the way he'd had them during the salute. But his eyes were different now. Not overwhelmed, not trying to contain something too large. Just full. Bright and full and looking directly at his father with an expression that was, at its core, very simple. "You said we were going to be fine." "And we are." Ben held his son's eyes. He felt something move through him that he was not going to name. Not here, not in this room, because he did not have the habit of naming things like that in rooms with other people in them. But it moved through him fully, from the chest outward, the particular feeling of a thing that has been in jeopardy for a long time, suddenly, solidly, no longer being in jeopardy. Claire touched his arm. "Ben," she said softly, "we're good." He nodded. He found his voice and said, very quietly, "Yeah. You can go get your kid." He stood. He walked to the low wooden gate. Ethan came through it and into his arms without hesitation, without the self-consciousness of an 11-year-old who is usually careful about being seen as a little kid. He came in fast and held on hard, his face against his father's chest, right up against the metals. And Ben wrapped his arms around his son and held him with the full, uncomplicated force of a man who has held very few things in his life more important than this. Neither of them spoke. They stood that way for a long moment in the well of courtroom 6, while the room around them quietly resumed the business of being a courthouse. General Brooks stood from her seat in the gallery. She walked to the gate. She stopped a few feet away and waited until Ben straightened, Ethan still tucked under his arm, and looked at her. She looked at them both, at the father and the son, at the coat and the medals, at the two faces that were, at this moment, more alike than different in their expression. That particular look of people who have come through something and are still sorting out what they feel about having come through it. She said, "Get him some lunch. He's earned it." Ben almost smiled. "Yes, General." She nodded once, in that clean, final way of a person who has done what they came to do. She turned. She walked back up the center aisle of the gallery, her two officers falling into step behind her, and she did not look back, because that was not her way, and the room watched her go in the particular silence reserved for moments when something irreplaceable is leaving it. At the defense table, Claire Donovan was packing her files with efficient, practiced movements. She looked up at Ben and Ethan and said, "I'm going to need you to explain the classified document situation to me at some point. Not professionally, just personally. Because I have been doing this job for 14 years, and that was—" She gestured vaguely at the room around her. "That was something else." Ben said, "Buy you a coffee?" She laughed, short and real, the kind of laugh that comes out of people who have been holding tension for several hours and have just been given permission to release it. "Yeah," she said, "you can absolutely buy me a coffee." Ethan looked up at his father. "Can I get hot chocolate?" Ben looked down at him. "You can get whatever you want," he said. They walked toward the door. The coffee shop was 3 blocks from the courthouse, a narrow place with exposed brick and the kind of lighting that made everything inside feel slightly warmer than the world outside. They found a table near the back window. Ben and Ethan on one side, Claire across from them, her coat still on, and her files stacked beside her cup, because she had not fully allowed herself to be off the clock yet, the way certain people cannot fully allow themselves to exhale until they are some distance from the thing that required them to hold their breath. Ethan had his hot chocolate. He was holding the mug with both hands, the way he'd held things since he was very small. And he was looking out the window at the street, with the quiet, processing expression of a boy who has been given a great deal to think about, and has decided to think about it carefully, rather than quickly. Claire wrapped both hands around her coffee and looked at Ben across the table. "Okay," she said. "Talk to me." Ben said, "About what specifically?" "About any of it. All of it." She shook her head slightly. "You walked into my office 3 weeks ago with a custody filing and a folder of employment records, and you were the most straightforward client I have had in years. Clean record, clear situation, documented everything I asked for. I thought this was going to be a long morning and a clean ruling." "It was a clean ruling," Ben said. "Ben," she gave him the look of a woman who has spent her career watching people reconstruct events in real time. "A 4-star general walked into that courtroom and saluted you in front of the judge who had just called your medals a costume. That is not a clean ruling. That is something else entirely." Ethan, without looking away from the window, said, "It was the best thing I've ever seen." Claire pointed at him. "Your son is right. It was the best thing I have ever seen, and I have been inside courtrooms for a very long time." She looked back at Ben. "So I am asking you, as someone who was on your side this morning and would like to understand what was on her side, who is General Dana Brooks to you?" Ben was quiet for a moment. He set down his cup. "She was my CO," he said. "Commanding officer. On my 3rd tour." "Fallujah?" "Yes." "And the operation she described, the extraction?" Ben looked at the table. "She gave you the broad version. What's the narrow version?" He was quiet for a moment, not unwilling, just locating the version of the story that lived outside the classified record, the version that belonged to the daylight. "It was 2007, he said. "We had 4 people in a building that had been compromised. 2 soldiers, 1 intelligence officer, 1 civilian contractor. The situation had been He paused, selected words with care. Deteriorating for about 48 hours. The extraction plan that existed before I got there had failed. The unit that was supposed to go in had taken casualties. When I arrived, the assessment was that we had a 6-hour window before that window closed permanently. Claire was very still. Ethan had turned from the window. He was watching his father's face with the full, unblinking attention of a boy who has waited a long time for this and is not going to miss a single word of it. General Brooks was the ranking officer on site, Ben continued. She was one of the 4 people in the building. She was also the one coordinating from inside, which meant she had more current intelligence than anyone outside. I made the call to go in with a 3-man team instead of waiting for reinforcements. It was... He stopped. It was not the textbook decision. Reinforcements would have taken 4 hours minimum. I didn't think we had 4 hours. I thought we had 1. Were you right? Claire asked. Yes. And you got them all out? Yes. And the Medal of Honor nomination was put forward by General Brooks after the fact, Ben said. I didn't ask for it. I didn't know about it until she told me. He picked up his coffee again. The nomination didn't go through. There were procedural considerations, things about the classified nature of the operation. But it's in the record. Claire looked at him for a long moment. And you never told anyone? I told the people who needed to know. The army. The process. He shrugged, and it was the most uncomplicated shrug, the shrug of a man to whom the question of who else needed to know had simply never presented itself as urgent. After I got out, I came back here. I got an apartment. I got work. I had Ethan on my weeks, and I tried to be a good father. He looked at his son. That's what I was doing. That's what I was focused on. The other stuff? It was real, and it happened, and I carry it. But it's not what I get up for in the morning. Ethan was looking at him with those big, steady eyes. He said, What do you get up for in the morning? Ben looked at his son the way a man looks at the clearest answer he has ever been given to the most important question anyone has ever asked him. You, he said. Simple as that. Ethan looked back at him for a long moment. Then he looked down at his hot chocolate, and he pressed his lips together, and he nodded once. And Ben could see the effort his son was making to hold the size of the feeling inside a container small enough to fit in a coffee shop. And he loved the boy fiercely and quietly for exactly that effort. Claire watched both of them and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, very softly, Ben, I want you to know something. He looked at her. What happened in that courtroom this morning? The way Albertson came at you, the comments, the contempt, that was not acceptable. And I want you to know that I am going to file a formal note regarding his conduct. Not to create a problem, not for drama, just because it needs to be in the record that it happened. Ben looked at her steadily. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to, she said. I'm choosing to, because the next person who walks into that room deserves a judge who has been reminded that there are consequences to using a bench as a place to perform contempt for people whose lives you don't understand. She held his gaze. You okay with that? Ben thought about it. He thought about the gallery that had laughed when Albertson made his joke. He thought about the particular sound of that laugh, the easy way it came, the way laughter always comes easily when it has been invited by someone in authority. He thought about all the people who walked into that courthouse every week with no general waiting for them, with no classified record, with just the ordinary truth of their lives and the hope that the person behind the bench would read that truth fairly. Yeah, he said, I'm okay with that. They sat for another hour in that coffee shop, the three of them, and the conversation slowly found its way out of the weight of the morning and into the lighter register of people who have come through something together and are now discovering each other in the aftermath. Claire turned out to have a son about Ethan's age. Ethan turned out to have questions about what public defenders actually did that were sharp and well organized, and that made Claire look at Ben with an expression that said very clearly, "You have done something right with this kid." Ben drank 2 cups of coffee and mostly listened, and occasionally said something that made the other two laugh, and the morning's courtroom felt like something that had happened in a different room, in a different kind of time. When they stepped out onto the sidewalk to say goodbye, Claire shook Ben's hand and held it for a moment. She said, "Call me if anything changes. With the job, with the arrangement, with anything." She paused. "Also, call me just to call me. I'd like to hear how you're both doing." Ben said, "We will." She looked at Ethan. "You were very brave today. What you did in that courtroom, standing up and saying what you said, that was not easy, and you did it anyway." Ethan said, "I had to." "I know," she said. "That's what makes it brave." She walked away down the sidewalk with her files under her arm and her coat pulled tight against the cold, and Ben watched her go, with the particular respect you develop for someone who has done good work beside you in a hard room. Then he looked at Ethan. "Ready?" Ethan looked up at him. "Where are we going?" "Home," Ben said. They walked. The afternoon had opened up slightly. The heavy gray of the morning had not entirely lifted, but it had loosened, the way certain days loosen in the late afternoon, even without sun, when the light finds a way through the edges. Ben and Ethan walked side by side on the sidewalk, close enough that their arms occasionally touched, neither of them moving away when they did. After a while, Ethan said, "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Always." "General Brooks, when she saluted you," he paused, "how did that feel?" Ben walked a few steps without answering. He was not avoiding the question. He was locating the true answer, the one underneath the first 3 answers that had come to mind, and that were all true, but not true enough. "It felt," he said slowly, "like being seen. By someone who was actually there." He paused. "Most of the time when people find out about what I did over there, they want to make it into something simple, something they can hold in one hand. Either I'm a hero, which I'm not. There's no such thing as a singular hero. There are just people making the best call available in bad situations. Or they don't believe it, which is also a simplification. General Brooks doesn't do either of those things. She knows exactly what it was. She was inside it. So when he stopped. When she did that, it wasn't about what it looked like from the outside. It was about what she knows, what we both know. And that's a very rare thing for someone to acknowledge something you've carried with you for 17 years exactly as it actually was. Ethan walked beside him and thought about this seriously. Then he said, "Is that why you never wore them? The medals?" "I wear them," Ben said. "Just not often." "But you wore them today." "I wore them today because it was cold," Ben said, "and because that coat is the warmest thing I own." Ethan looked at him sideways with the expression of a boy who has developed a sophisticated enough understanding of his father to know when he is giving the complete version of the truth and when he is giving the accurate version. "Just because it was cold," he said. Ben smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. "And maybe," he said, "because some days you need to remember who you are when you walk into a room. Not for the room, for yourself." Ethan nodded slowly. "So you wore them for you. I wore them for me." Ethan looked straight ahead. "That's okay," he said. "I think that's okay, Dad." Ben put his arm around his son's shoulders as they walked. "Yeah," he said. "I think it is too." They had almost reached the car when Ben's phone buzzed. He looked at it. A message from a number he recognized. It read, "Lunch next week. Not optional. Brooks." Ben looked at the message for a moment. Then he put the phone back in his pocket and kept walking. "Who was that?" Ethan asked. "General Brooks." Ethan's face did something involuntary. A flash of the morning's awe returning briefly. "What did she say?" "She wants to have lunch." Ethan processed this. "Are you going to go?" "She said it's not optional." Ethan grinned. A real, wide, unguarded grin. The kind that transformed his face completely and made him look exactly like the small boy he had been not so long ago, and was, despite everything, still in the ways that mattered most. "So you're going." "So I'm going," Ben agreed. They reached the car. Ben unlocked it and they got in. And for a moment they both just sat in the warmth of the enclosed space after the cold of the street, doing nothing. The way you sometimes do nothing when you have been moving through something for a long time and have finally reached a place where it is safe to stop. Ethan pulled his seatbelt across his chest and clicked it. He looked out the windshield at the street. Then he looked at his father. "Dad," he said. "Yeah?" "I'm glad you didn't take off the coat." Ben looked at him. "When?" "When he told you to. When the judge said—" Ethan paused, and something moved through his expression. The remnant of the morning's hurt. "When he said that thing about the costume, you could have just taken it off, to make it easier." Ben was quiet. "But you didn't," Ethan said. "You just said it was warm." "It was warm," Ben said. "I know, but it was also—" Ethan searched for the word with the seriousness of a boy who knows the word exists and intends to find it. "It was also true, about who you are. And you didn't take that off just because someone told you to." He looked at his father. "I want to be like that, when I'm older. I want to be the kind of person who doesn't take things off just because someone tells them to." Ben looked at his son for a long time. He looked at him the way you look at someone when you understand that a thing you have tried to give them for years, a thing you were never certain had arrived, has just confirmed itself as present and real and entirely their own. "You already are," Ben said. Ethan looked at him. "You think so?" "What you did in that courtroom today," Ben said. "Standing up in front of a judge who had the whole room behind him and saying what you said." He paused. "That's not something you learn in a week. That's something that comes from who you are. I didn't teach you that. You did that." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands in his lap. When he looked up again, his eyes were bright but steady, the same way they had been steady all day. The steadiness of a boy who has decided something about himself and is in the process of it becoming permanent. "Okay," he said softly. "Okay." Ben started the car. They drove through the city in the long, easy quiet of two people who have said what they needed to say and are now comfortable with the silence between them. The way people are comfortable with silence when the silence is not empty, but is full of something understood. The streets moved past the windows, ordinary and familiar. The bakery on Clement that Ethan always asked to stop at. The park where they had spent Saturday mornings when Ethan was smaller. The overpass with the mural that changed every year and that Ethan tracked from year to year, the way some people track the seasons. Ben drove and thought about the morning, not with the churning, processing energy of someone still working through trauma, but with the particular quality of reflection that comes when something is genuinely behind you. He thought about Albertson reading that document. He thought about the way the man's face had changed, page by page, line by line. The way understanding arrives in a person when they have been wrong in a significant way and are honest enough to let it register. He did not hate Albertson for the morning. He never had. What Albertson had done was not unusual. It was the predictable behavior of a man who had been behind a bench long enough to stop seeing the individuals in front of it and had started seeing instead the categories they appeared to belong to. A veteran in a worn coat with old medals and an unstable bank account had a category, and Albertson had placed him in it without looking closely enough to see that the category was wrong. Ben had been placed in categories before. He had learned, in a life that had required this lesson multiple times, that the most dangerous thing about categories was not that they were mean, but that they were lazy, that they replaced the work of actually seeing a person with the convenience of a preformed conclusion. And he had learned, also, that the only answer to a category was exactly what he had done all morning. Stand in it. Stay visible. Be entirely what you are, and let the truth do its work on its own schedule. It had done its work today. In 22 minutes, on the second floor of the Northwood County Courthouse, it had done 17 years of work. He thought about the men whose names were attached to those medals, the men whose faces came to him sometimes at night, in the specific, unscheduled way that certain memories arrive, not because you summoned them, but because they live somewhere close and occasionally simply step forward. He thought about what they would make of this morning. He thought they would probably find it, in the way soldiers find things, more funny than tragic. He thought they would have given him a hard time about the costume comment, and then bought him a drink. He thought they would have liked Ethan. He always thought that. Every time he thought about them, which was more than anyone knew and less than it used to be. He thought they would have liked Ethan. He drove, and he let himself have that thought for a moment, fully. Then he let it recede, the way the good things you carry recede back to wherever they live in you, patient and permanent, waiting for the next time you need to reach for them. Ethan had fallen slightly asleep, not all the way. He was at the age where he maintained a performance of wakefulness, even when his body had other plans. But his eyes were half closed, and his head was resting against the window, and his breathing had evened out into the slow rhythm of someone who has expended a great deal of energy holding themselves together, and has finally, in the warmth and safety of a car driven by his father, allowed himself to let go of the effort. Ben glanced at him. He looked at his son's face in the afternoon light, the soft line of his jaw, the dark lashes, the slight furrow in his brow that Ethan carried even in sleep, the mark of a boy who thinks hard about everything and cannot entirely stop, even when he is unconscious. He looked at the boy he had driven 40 minutes each way to see play soccer, the boy he had sat outside the bedroom door for on a night when the fever was bad and the fear was worse. The boy who had stood up in a courtroom full of strangers and spoken the truest thing anyone had said all morning, in a voice that did not break until the very last word, and then pulled itself back together before it had the chance to fall. Ben looked at his son, and he felt the thing he always felt when he looked at him. The thing that did not have a clean name, the thing that lived below the level of language, in a place where only the most essential truths live. The recognition that this, right here, in this car, on this ordinary street, in this regular afternoon that looked exactly like any other regular afternoon, was what it had all been for. All of it. Every hard room, every long night, every year, every decision, every cost. Not the medals, not the rank, not the classified record or the nomination or the operation or any of the things that had been named this morning in the formal language of official recognition. This. His son's face. His son's life. His son's voice saying, "I know they're real." Ben looked back at the road. He reached over and pulled Ethan's jacket slightly tighter, where it had fallen open at the collar. The small, automatic gesture of a father, as natural and unremarkable as breathing. Ethan stirred slightly, but did not wake. Ben drove. The city moved around them, steady and indifferent and ongoing, the way cities are, full of mornings that become afternoons, that become evenings that people carry with them into the next day, some forgotten, some never. This one would not be forgotten, not by the people who were in that room, not by Claire Donovan, who would file her note and tell the story for years, not by Gerald Stokes, who would be more careful the next time and would know why without being able to fully explain it. Not by the bailiff, or the gallery, or the court clerk who had slowed in the hallway at the sight of 4 stars and walked away knowing she had seen something she would tell her husband about at dinner. And not by Judge Trent Albertson, who would sit behind his bench tomorrow, and the day after, and every day following, and who would, if he was the kind of man who could be changed by a morning, and the evidence suggested he was, look at each person who came through the door of courtroom 6 just a little more carefully than he had before. Look at the coat before he read the category. Look at the face before he chose the tone. Remember the sound of boot heels on marble and what they turned out to mean. Maybe. Ben did not know. He was not in the business of predicting what other people would do with the truth once it had been laid in front of them. He only knew what he would do with it, and what he had always done with it, which was to carry it the same way he carried everything, without drama, without announcement, and without ever setting it down. The apartment building came into view. Ben pulled into the lot and parked. He turned off the engine. Ethan blinked awake fully. He looked around, registered that they were home, and then looked at his father with the direct, unguarded attention of someone who has just woken up and has not yet put the day's filters back in place. "We're here," Ethan said. "We're here," Ben agreed. Ethan looked at the building, then back at his father. He reached over and put his hand on Ben's arm. Just laid it there, the way a person places a hand when the gesture is the whole sentence, and the sentence does not need any other words. Ben covered his son's hand with his own. They sat like that for a moment in the quiet of the parked car, father and son, in the ordinary miracle of being exactly where they were supposed to be. Then Ethan said, "Can we make grilled cheese for dinner?" Ben looked at him. He looked at this boy, this brave, clear-eyed, grilled cheese-wanting boy who had stood up in front of a judge today and told the truth with a trembling voice and a steady spine. And he felt the particular joy that only comes after a long, hard day. The joy that is not loud or performed, that is just warmth, just the simple warmth of being here, being whole, being together. "Yeah," Ben said, "we can make grilled cheese." They got out of the car. They walked into the building together, the father and his son, neither of them in a hurry, neither of them looking back. The worn olive coat moved with Ben as he walked, its metals quiet against his chest, not for show, not for the world, just there. The way the best things about a person are always just there, patient and real and permanent, waiting to be seen by anyone willing to look closely enough. And in the end, that is the only truth that matters about a man like Benjamin Dawson. Not what he did in Fallujah, not what the document said, not the 4 stars that had stood in the center of a courtroom and saluted him in front of everyone who had laughed. The truth that matters is this: he came home. He showed up. He sat at the table every night, and he made the breakfast, and he drove the 40 minutes, and he held the line in every quiet, unwitnessed way that fathers hold the line, day after day after day, in the rooms where no one is watching, and no one is taking notes, and the only record is the life of the child who grows up knowing, in the deepest and most unshakable way a person can know anything, that they were worth every bit of it. That is who Benjamin Dawson was. That is who he had always been. And now, finally, completely, and without a single remaining doubt in that courthouse or anywhere else, the world knew it too.